The Manhattan skyline glittered outside the studio windows, a constellation of ambition and dreams. But inside the set of The Pulse, the air was electric with anticipation. The show, a primetime juggernaut that drew millions of American viewers each week, was the kind of place where political heavyweights duked it out, where soundbites were born and careers could be made or broken in a single segment. Tonight, though, the guest list was unconventional. In one chair sat Will Smith, the Hollywood icon whose megawatt smile and blockbuster films had made him a household name. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he exuded a calm confidence, his presence commanding even before he spoke. Across from him was Karoline Leavitt, a political commentator with a razor-sharp tongue and a reputation for turning debates into verbal cage matches. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her eyes glinting with the kind of intensity that suggested she was always 3 steps ahead. The audience, a diverse mix of New Yorkers and out-of-towners, buzzed with excitement, their whispers filling the studio as the cameras rolled. They expected fireworks, maybe a lively debate about art and culture, but no one could have predicted the seismic moment that was about to unfold, a moment that would leave the nation stunned and redefine what it meant to stand tall under pressure. The host, David Holt, a seasoned journalist with a knack for keeping even the wildest debates on track, kicked things off with a warm introduction. "Folks, tonight we're diving into a different kind of conversation," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "We've got Will Smith here, not to talk about his latest movie, but to discuss how art can bridge the divides in our society." And joining him is Karoline Leavitt, one of the sharpest minds in political commentary. "Let's get started." The audience clapped, the lights dimmed slightly, and David turned to Will with his first question. "Will, you've built a career telling stories on the big screen. What do you think art can do to heal a country as divided as ours?" Will leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely, that familiar smile lighting up his face. "David, I believe stories are how we make sense of the world," he began, his voice warm and deliberate. "When I played Chris Gardner in The Pursuit of Happiness, it wasn't just about one man's struggle. It was about every person who's ever fought to keep going, to find hope when the odds are stacked against them. Art, whether it's a movie, a song, or a painting, lets us walk in someone else's shoes. It's a reminder that we're all human, no matter where we come from." The audience nodded, a few people clapping softly. It was a solid answer, thoughtful and heartfelt, the kind of response you'd expect from a man who'd spent decades using his platform to inspire. But Karoline wasn't here to nod along. She shifted in her seat, her lips curling into a slight smirk. "That's a nice sentiment, Will," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But let's be real. You're an actor. You make millions playing pretend. How does that qualify you to talk about the real issues tearing this country apart?" The audience stirred, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. David raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift in tone, but Will didn't flinch. He tilted his head, his smile unwavering, though his eyes narrowed just enough to hint at the steel beneath his charm. "Karoline, I don't pretend when I tell stories," he said, his voice steady. "Every role I take is a chance to learn, to dig into what makes people tick. I've sat with folks who've lost everything, who've fought battles most of us can't imagine. Art isn't just entertainment, it's a way to connect, to build bridges. That's what I'm here to talk about." The audience clapped again, louder this time, and a few people shouted, "That's right." Karoline's smirk faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly, leaning forward like a boxer ready to throw a punch. "Come on, Will," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You live in a mansion in Beverly Hills. You fly private jets. You're not exactly out here living the struggle. What do you know about the average American's problems?" The crowd gasped, the tension in the room spiking. David tried to interject, his hands gesturing for calm. "Let's keep this civil, folks," he said. But Karoline waved him off, her eyes locked on Will. She was in her element now, sensing an opportunity to take control of the narrative. The audience leaned forward, some whispering to their neighbors, others clutching their armrests. Social media was already lighting up, with viewers at home tweeting furiously about the brewing showdown. Will took a slow breath, his gaze never leaving Karoline. "You're right, Karoline," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've been blessed. I've worked hard, and I've had opportunities a lot of folks don't get, but I didn't start out in a mansion. I grew up in West Philly, where you had to watch your back just walking to school. My mom worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, and my dad taught me that respect isn't given, it's earned." He paused, letting his words sink in. The audience was quiet now, hanging on his every syllable. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to be told you're not good enough. That's why I do what I do, to give a voice to those stories. Karoline scoffed, crossing her arms. That's a great story, Will, but this isn't a movie set. This is the real world, where people are dealing with inflation, crime, division. You think your little films are going to fix that? Her words were like a jab, designed to provoke, and the audience reacted. A few people booed, while others shouted encouragement to Will. David tried to steer the conversation back on track. Let's focus on the topic, he said. But Karoline was relentless. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a mocking whisper. Sit down, kid, she said, the words slicing through the air like a blade. This is a grown-up conversation. The studio went silent, dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. David's jaw dropped, his eyes wide with shock. The audience froze, their collective gasp echoing through the room. On social media, the hashtag #SitDownKid exploded, trending within seconds. Viewers at home were tweeting, texting, calling friends. Did she just say that? Karoline sat back, a smug grin on her face, clearly thinking she'd landed a knockout blow. She expected Will to crumble, to storm off, or at least to fire back with anger. But Will Smith wasn't that guy. Slowly, deliberately, Will stood up. His movements were calm, almost graceful, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He buttoned his suit jacket, took a step toward the center of the stage, and turned to face Karoline. The audience held its breath, every eye locked on him. Karoline, he said, his voice low but resonant, you just called me a kid. You told me to sit down. But let me tell you something. I've been called worse. I've been called things that would make your hair curl, back when I was a skinny kid from Philly trying to make something of myself. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And every time I had a choice, sit down or stand up. I chose to stand. The audience erupted. Claps and cheers filled the studio, a wave of sound that seemed to shake the walls. A woman in the front row, her eyes glistening, shouted, "You tell her, Will." A young man in the back pumped his fist, yelling, "Keep going." Karoline's smug grin vanished, replaced by a flicker of unease. She hadn't expected this. She thought she could rattle him, turn him into a punchline. But Will was no one's punchline. He turned to the audience now, his presence filling the room like a preacher at a revival. "Let me tell you about the kid I used to be," he said, his voice rich with emotion. "I grew up in a neighborhood where dreams were a luxury. My mom worked as a school administrator by day and cleaned offices at night. She'd come home with her hands raw, her feet aching, but she never let us see her break. She'd say, 'Will, you've got to work twice as hard to get half as far.' And my dad, he was tough as nails. He taught me discipline, taught me that no one's going to hand you respect, you've got to earn it every single day." The crowd was riveted, leaning forward in their seats. A few people were wiping tears from their eyes, nodding as if Will's words were pulling memories from their own lives. He continued, his voice growing stronger. "When I started in this business, I wasn't Will Smith, the movie star. I was a rapper, a kid with a dream and a whole lot of doubters. I got laughed out of rooms, told I'd never make it. Casting directors said I wasn't leading man material. Producers said I was too urban. But I kept going because I knew something they didn't, my story mattered. And so does yours." The applause was deafening now, a roar that seemed to come from the soul of the audience. David Holt, still reeling from Karoline's outburst, looked at Will with something like awe. Karoline, meanwhile, was visibly rattled. Her hands fidgeted with the note cards on her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. She tried to jump in, her voice sharp. "This isn't a therapy session, Will," she snapped. "We're here to talk about real issues, not your sob story." But the audience wasn't having it. A chorus of boos drowned her out, and someone shouted, "Let him speak." Will raised a hand, signaling for calm. "It's okay," he said, his voice steady. "Let her talk. Everyone deserves to be heard." The crowd quieted, but their energy was still with him. A palpable force. He turned back to Karoline, his eyes locking onto hers. "You say I don't know the real world, Karoline, but I've lived it. I've seen what happens when people are counted out, when they're told their voice doesn't matter. That's why I make movies, why I tell stories. Because every time someone sees themselves in a character I play, they're reminded that they're not invisible. The audience was on its feet now, clapping and cheering. A man in a worn denim jacket stood up, his voice trembling. "I lost my job last year," he said, unprompted. "Watching your movies, Will, it kept me going. You're real, man." A woman next to him nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You make us feel seen," she said. The moment was raw, unscripted, and it hit like a thunderbolt. Caroline, for the first time, looked small, her confidence crumbling under the weight of Will's authenticity. Will stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice softening but no less powerful. "Caroline, when you told me to sit down, you weren't just talking to me. You were talking to every kid who's been told they're not enough. Every person who's been pushed aside, dismissed, ignored. But here's the thing: we don't stay down. We stand up. Not to fight, not to tear each other apart, but to remind the world that we're here and we matter." The studio was a sea of emotion, now tears, cheers, fists raised in solidarity. David Holt, wiping his eyes, tried to regain control. "Will, I've got to say, you're changing the game tonight," he said, his voice thick. Caroline, desperate to claw back some ground, leaned forward. "This is a debate, not a fan convention," she said, but her words fell flat, swallowed by the crowd's energy. The audience was done with her, their allegiance firmly with Will. As the segment neared its end, Will looked out at the crowd, his eyes shining with purpose. "I didn't come here to win an argument," he said. "I came here to start a conversation. Because if we can't talk to each other, if we can't listen, then we're never going to heal. So let's start right here, right now." The applause was like a tidal wave, washing over the studio, the city, the nation. Will Smith had walked into a trap and turned it into a triumph, not with anger, but with heart. And as the cameras panned across the audience faces wet with tears, hands clasped in unity, it was clear that this was only the beginning. The studio lights of the Pulse burned brighter now, or so it seemed, as Will Smith stood at the center of the stage, his silhouette framed against the backdrop of a stunned audience. The air was thick with emotion, a cocktail of awe, anger, and inspiration that pulsed through the room like a heartbeat. Karoline Leavitt's words, "Sit down," kid still hung in the air, a miscalculated jab that had backfired spectacularly. The audience, a mosaic of faces reflecting every corner of America, was no longer just watching a talk show. They were part of something bigger, something raw and real. Will's response had turned the tables, transforming a moment meant to humiliate him into a rallying cry for dignity. But the night was far from over, and Will was about to take the conversation to a place no one and either Caroline, the host David Holt, nor the millions watching at home could have anticipated. David, still reeling from the intensity of the opening segment, adjusted his tie and leaned forward, his voice a mix of admiration and caution. "Will, you've given us a lot to think about," he said, glancing at the audience, who were still buzzing with energy. "You've talked about your roots, about standing up when the world tells you to sit down. But let's dive deeper. How do you take that personal story and use it to address the bigger issues we're facing as a country?" It was a good question, one meant to steer the conversation back to the show's original premise, the role of art in healing division. But Will wasn't here to play by the script. He nodded, acknowledging David's question, but his eyes were on the audience, searching their faces as if looking for a connection. "David, it's not just about my story," he said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency. "It's about all our stories. Every person in this room, every person watching at home, they've got a story that shaped who they are. And when we share those stories, when we really listen, that's when we start to understand each other. That's when we start to heal." The audience murmured in agreement, a few heads nodding, but Caroline wasn't ready to let him have the floor. She leaned forward, her arms crossed tightly, her face a mask of barely concealed frustration. "Will, that sounds nice, but it's naive," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the room's warmth. "Stories don't fix systemic problems. They don't lower gas prices or stop crime. You're selling a fantasy, and honestly, it's a little insulting to the people who are dealing with real-world issues." Her words were calculated, designed to paint Will as out of touch, a Hollywood dreamer who couldn't grasp the gritty realities of everyday life. A few audience members shifted uncomfortably, but the majority stayed locked on Will, waiting for his response. Will didn't take the bait. Instead, he stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Caroline, you're right, stories don't pay the bills," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But they do something just as important. They remind us why we're fighting in the first place. Let me tell you about a time when a story changed my life. He paused, letting the silence build, drawing every eye in the room to him. When I was a kid, maybe 12 or 13, I was getting into trouble nothing serious, just dumb stuff kids do. My mom sat me down one night, and instead of yelling, she told me about her childhood. She grew up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, where she had to dodge danger just to get to school. She told me how she'd hide her fear so her little sister wouldn't feel it, how she'd study by candlelight because the power got cut off. That story wasn't just words, it was a map. It showed me what resilience looked like, what sacrifice meant. It made me want to be better, not just for me, but for her. The audience was silent, absorbing every word. A woman in the third row, her hair streaked with gray, clutched her purse, her eyes glistening. Will continued, his voice growing softer, more intimate. That's what stories do. They're not just entertainment, they're lessons, they're warnings, they're hope. When I made The Pursuit of Happiness, I wasn't just acting. I was telling the story of every parent who's ever gone hungry so their kid could eat, every person who's ever chased a dream against impossible odds. And you know what? People came up to me after that. Movie strangers, cab drivers, teachers, single moms, and they told me their stories. They said, Will, I saw myself in that film. It made me believe I could keep going. That's not a fantasy, Caroline. That's power. The crowd erupted, a wave of applause and cheers that seemed to lift the roof. A young man in a hoodie stood up, clapping so hard his hands must have stung. That's real, Will, he shouted, and others echoed him, their voices blending into a chorus of support. Caroline's face tightened, her knuckles white as she gripped her note cards. She wasn't used to being upstaged, and it showed. This isn't a TED Talk, she snapped, her voice rising. You're dodging the question. How does any of this solve the problems we're facing? You're just playing the victim card, and it's getting old. Her words were a desperate attempt to regain control, but they only fueled the audience's frustration. A few people booed, and someone yelled, "Let him talk." David raised a hand, trying to restore order. "Let's keep it respectful," he said, but his eyes were on Will, clearly curious about what he'd do next. Will, unfazed, turned to Caroline, his expression not angry but searching, as if trying to understand her. "Caroline, I'm not playing a victim," he said. "I'm telling you what I've lived, what I've seen, and I'm not the only one." He turned back to the audience, his voice rising with a quiet intensity. "How many of you have a story that's kept you going? A moment, a memory, a person who showed you what's possible?" Hands shot up across the room, tentative at first, then bold. A murmur of voices rose, people whispering to each other, sharing fragments of their own lives. Then, unexpectedly, a young woman stood up. She was in her early 20s, her braids tied back, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "Can I say something?" she asked, her eyes fixed on Will. David, caught off guard, nodded, signaling for a microphone to be passed to her. The woman took a deep breath, her words carrying a weight that silenced the room. "My name's Aisha," she said. "I grew up in a rough part of Chicago. My dad was in and out of jail, and my mom worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. There were days I thought I'd never make it out. But when I was 15, I saw The Pursuit of Happiness. That movie, your story, Will It, showed me that I could dream bigger. I'm in college now, studying to be a social worker. You didn't just make a movie, you gave me hope." The audience exploded, a standing ovation that shook the studio. Aisha's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, her chin high. Will placed a hand over his heart, his own eyes glistening. "Aisha, you're the reason I do this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for sharing your story." The crowd roared louder, some people hugging their neighbors, others wiping tears from their cheeks. It was a moment of connection, of shared humanity, and it was happening live on national television. Caroline, visibly shaken, tried to pivot. "That's touching, but it's one person," she said, her voice strained. "You can't change a country with anecdotes. We need policy, action, not warm fuzzies." But her words fell flat, drowned out by the crowd's energy. Another audience member stood up, this time an older man in a faded military cap, his hands weathered but strong. "I'm a veteran," he said, his voice rough but clear, "served in Afghanistan. When I came home, I struggled PTSD, no job, no direction. I watched Men in Black with my kids one night, and for the first time in months, I laughed." Will, you've used your platform to talk about mental health, to show guys like me we're not alone. That's not just a story that's saving lives. The applause was deafening now, a tidal wave of sound that seemed to push Karoline further into her seat. She opened her mouth to respond, but the crowd's energy was overwhelming, a collective rejection of her cynicism. Will, sensing the moment, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. The room quieted, every eye on him. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a letter I got a few years ago. It's from a kid named Jamal, 16 years old, from Detroit. He wrote to me after seeing Ali." Will unfolded the paper, its edges worn from being handled so often. He said, "Mr. Smith, I never thought I could be anything. My neighborhood's full of drugs, gangs, no way out. But watching you play Muhammad Ali, I saw what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. I'm training to be a boxer now, and I'm going to make my mom proud." Will's voice cracked slightly as he read, and the audience felt he'd a raw, unfiltered connection. "Jamal sent me this letter 3 years ago," he continued, folding it carefully. "Last month, I got an update. He's 19 now, won a regional boxing title, and he's mentoring younger kids in his community. That's what a story can do, Karoline. It's not about fixing everything, it's about giving people the strength to fix themselves." The studio was a sea of emotion, tears streaming down faces, hands clasped in solidarity. A woman in the back row stood, her voice trembling. "My son's autistic," she said, unprompted. "Your movies, Will, they're the only thing that makes him smile. Thank you for giving us that." Another voice chimed in, a young man in a wheelchair. "I'm a filmmaker because of you," he said. "You showed me I could tell my story too." One by one, people stood, their voices weaving a tapestry of gratitude and resilience. It wasn't just about Will anymore, it was about the power of shared humanity, unleashed in a single, unforgettable moment. Karoline, her face flushed, tried one last time to regain control. "This is emotional manipulation," she said, her voice shrill. "You're turning a serious discussion into a circus." But the audience wasn't listening. They booed, their voices a unified rebuke. David, sensing the shift, leaned toward Will. "You've got this room in the palm of your hand," he said, his voice low but audible. "What do you want to say to the people watching at home?" Will stepped to the edge of the stage, his eyes burning with purpose. "I want to say this," he said, his voice carrying a quiet power. "Your story matters. Whether you're a single mom working 2 jobs, a veteran finding your way, a kid with a dream, no one can take that from you. And when we share our stories, we're not just talking. We're building something stronger than division, stronger than hate. So don't let anyone tell you to sit down. Stand up and let the world hear you." The audience was on its feet, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundation of the studio. People were crying, hugging, shouting Will's name. Social media was ablaze, with "Stand Up with Will" trending worldwide. Karoline sat frozen, her hands trembling, realizing she'd underestimated not just Will, but the power of authenticity. The segment ended, but the energy lingered, a spark that would soon ignite a national conversation. Will had turned a moment of disrespect into a movement, and the night was still young. The studio of the Pulse was no longer just a set, it was a crucible, forging something rare and profound in the heat of raw human connection. The audience, a tapestry of strangers united by Will Smith's words, stood on their feet, their applause a thunderous hymn to resilience and truth. Will stood at the edge of the stage, his navy suit slightly rumpled now, but his presence unshaken, a beacon in the storm of emotion that had swept through the room. Karoline Leavitt's chair was empty. Her abrupt exit after her failed attempts to derail Will had left a void, but it was one the audience barely noticed. They were captivated, not by the drama of her departure, but by the man who had turned an insult into a movement. The hashtag #StandUpWithWill was trending globally, with millions sharing clips of the night's events. But inside the studio, the moment felt intimate, as if the world had shrunk to this one room, this one man, and the shared heartbeat of everyone present. David Holt, the host, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his usual polish giving way to something more human. He knew he was witnessing history, and as the cameras rolled, he leaned forward, ready to guide the conversation to its crescendo. "Will," David said, his voice tinged with reverence, "you've turned this show upside down tonight. You've got this audience check, the whole country hanging on your every word. But I want to ask you something different now. We're a nation at odds, fighting over politics, race, money, you name it. How do we move forward from here? How do we take what you've started tonight and make it more than a moment? The question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. The audience quieted, their eyes locked on Will, waiting for an answer that could match the intensity of what had come before. Will took a slow breath, his gaze sweeping the crowd. He wasn't just looking at them, he was seeing them. Every face, a story, every heart, a piece of the puzzle he was trying to solve. David, he began, his voice low but resonant. We don't move forward by shouting louder or pointing fingers. We move forward by building something together. Not walls, not divisions, but bridges. And the way we build those bridges is by choosing to see each other, really see each other even when it's hard. He paused, letting the words settle, and the audience leaned in, their silence a testament to his command. Tonight we've talked about stories mine, Aisha's, the veterans, Jamal's. But this isn't about one person's story. It's about what happens when we weave them together, when we say, your pain matters, your dreams matter, your life matters. That's how we heal a nation. The crowd stirred, a ripple of murmurs and nods. Will stepped closer to the audience, his voice growing stronger, more urgent. Let me tell you about a moment that changed how I see this country, he said. A few years ago, I was in a small town in Ohio filming a project. After a long day, I stopped at a diner. Just a regular spot, nothing fancy. The waitress, a woman named Linda, recognized me. She was shy at first, but she came over and said, Mr. Smith, your movies got me through some dark times. I asked her what she meant, and she told me her story. Her husband had passed away. She was raising 2 kids alone, working double shifts to make ends meet. She said watching Hitch with her kids was the only time they laughed together after he died. That night, I didn't just meet a Fanny, met a warrior. Linda's story stuck with me because it reminded me that every person we pass on the street is carrying something we can't see. And if we can't see them, we can't help them. The audience was spellbound, their faces a mix of tears and determination. A man in a flannel shirt, his hands calloused from years of manual labor, stood up, unprompted. I'm a truck driver, he said, his voice rough but steady. I've seen this country from coast to coast, and I'm tired of the hate, the arguing. Will, you're right, we gotta start seeing each other. I'm in. The crowd cheered, a surge of energy that felt like a pledge. Will nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. That's it, man, he said. That's where it starts. One person, one choice, one bridge at a time. Karoline's absence loomed, but it was a distant thought now, overshadowed by the momentum Will had created. David, sensing the opportunity to deepen the moment, leaned forward. Will, you're talking about unity, about bridges. But let's be real, there are people out there, maybe even some watching tonight, who'll say this is just talk. They'll say it's too idealistic, that we're too far gone. What do you say to them? It was a challenge, but a fair one, and the audience waited, their breaths held, for Will's response. Will smiled, a spark of mischief in his eyes, but his voice was serious. To those folks, I'd say this, I get it. It's easy to be cynical, the world's messy, and we've got real problems. But cynicism doesn't build anything, it just tears down. Let me tell you about another moment that showed me what's possible. He stepped to the side as if making room for the memory. When I was working on concussion, I spent time with Dr. Bennett Omalu, the real-life doctor who took on the NFL to expose the truth about brain injuries. He's an immigrant, a man who came to this country with nothing but his education and his courage. He faced pushback, threats, people telling him to back off, but he kept going because he believed one truth could save lives. I sat with him one night, and he said something I'll never forget. Will, change doesn't come from the loudest voice. It comes from the one that won't quit. That's not idealism, that's grit. And America's got more grit than we give it credit for. The audience roared, their applause a declaration of belief. A woman in a nurse's uniform stood, her voice cutting through the noise. I work in the ER, she said. Every day, I see people at their worst hurt, scared, angry. But I also see them help each other, strangers holding hands, sharing what little they have. Will, you're right. We've got grit. We just need to remember it. The crowd cheered louder, a wave of affirmation that seemed to lift Will even higher. David, his eyes wide with admiration, turned to the camera. Folks at home, if you're just joining us, you're witnessing something extraordinary. Will Smith is redefining what it means to have a conversation in this country. But before he could continue, a producer slipped him a note, and his expression shifted surprise, then excitement. Will, he said, we've got something special for you. Can we roll the tape? The audience buzzed with curiosity as the screen behind the stage lit up, revealing a young boy, maybe 14, sitting in a modest living room. His eyes were bright, his smile wide, and he held a piece of paper with "Thank you," Will scrawled in marker. Hi, Mr. Smith, the boy said, his voice trembling with nerves but clear. My name's Tyler. I'm from Atlanta. 2 years ago, my mom got sick and we lost our house. I was mad, scared, didn't know what to do. But your foundation helped us pay for my school, got us a place to stay. I'm graduating high school next year, and I'm going to college because of you. The audience gasped, then erupted in cheers. Tyler's eyes welled up, but he kept going. You didn't just give us money. You gave me a reason to believe in myself. So I want to say thank you, not just for me, but for my mom, my little sister, everybody you've helped. The studio was a sea of tears now, people openly weeping, hugging strangers, their voices a chorus of, oh my God, and that's beautiful. Will, for the first time that night, looked overcome. He placed a hand over his heart, his lips trembling as he mouthed, thank you, Tyler. The boy on the screen waved, his smile radiant, in the feed cut, leaving the audience in a state of raw, unfiltered emotion. David, wiping his eyes, turned to Will. I don't even know what to say, he admitted. That was powerful. Will nodded, his voice thick. Tyler's the hero here, he said. He's proof that when we lift each other up, we're unstoppable. That's what I want for this country. Not more fighting, but more Tylers, more Lindas, more Aishas. People who remind us what we're capable of when we choose hope over hate. The audience was on its feet again, their applause, a tidal wave that seemed to shake the very walls of the studio. Social media was ablaze, with posts flooding in. Will Smith just broke my heart and put it back together. Tyler's story is why we need more people like Will. The hashtag #StandUpWithWill was now a global phenomenon, shared in languages from Spanish to Mandarin. David, sensing the moment's weight, turned to the audience. I've been doing this job a long time, he said, his voice cracking, but I've never seen anything like this. Will, you've turned a talk show into a movement. What's your final message to America tonight? The question was a gift, a chance for Will to seal the night with something unforgettable. And he didn't hesitate. He stepped to the center of the stage, the lights catching the sheen of sweat on his brow, his eyes burning with purpose. America, he said, addressing the camera directly, we're at a crossroads. We can keep tearing each other down, or we can choose something better. I'm asking you to choose better. Not for me, not for fame or applause, but for the Tylers out there, the kids who need us to show them what's possible. Start where you are, listen to your neighbor, help a stranger, share your story. Because when we do that, we're not just surviving, we're thriving. And that's the America I believe in. The studio erupted, a standing ovation that went on for what felt like forever. People were crying, cheering, some raising their fists in solidarity, others embracing those next to them. David stood too, clapping, his face a mix of awe and gratitude. Will Smith, ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice barely audible over the roar. You've given us something to carry forward. As the show went to commercial, the energy didn't fade. Backstage, producers were scrambling, phones buzzing with calls from news outlets, celebrities, even politicians. A message arrived from a prominent civil rights organization, requesting permission to feature Will's words in their upcoming campaign. But Will, still on stage, was oblivious to the chaos. He shook hands with audience members who approached, their words tumbling out in a rush of gratitude. You spoke for us, one woman said, her voice choked. You made me proud to be American, said another. Hours later, as Will left the studio, he was met by a crowd outside, their signs reading, Stand Up With Will and We See You. They chanted his name, their voices a symphony of unity. The next day, a letter arrived at his hotel, handwritten on plain stationery. It was from Karoline Leavitt. Will, it read, I was wrong. I tried to tear you down, but you built something instead. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope we can learn from this. Your strength showed me what I need to work on. Will read it quietly, then posted a response online. Karoline, we all mess up. What matters is what we do next. Let's build those bridges together. The moment became more than a viral clip, it became a spark. Across the country, people began sharing their stories, organizing community events, starting conversations that had long been avoided. Will's words echoed in classrooms, churches, barbershops, and boardrooms, a reminder that unity wasn't a dream but a choice. And in the studio, a single chair remained on stage, unmarked but understood, a symbol of the night. One man stood up and showed America what it could be.